Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's edition of the Berkeley Forum. My name is Cindy Tang, and I am the current president of the Berkeley Forum, and we'd like to welcome you to our first event of the semester, a panel on H-1B visas and immigration. This event is going to kick off our lineup for this semester, which we are so grateful to be putting on virtually this semester. The mission of the Berkeley Forum revolves around bringing discourse to campus, but given the present situation, we've seen both an opportunity and an imperative to enlarge this mission of discourse to reach all corners of the internet, which is why we have been able to bring this event to you live online today. Thank you all so much for coming, and I'm going to start with a few introductory pieces. So we have two forms here that we would love for people to fill out if willing and able. To start, we have an attendance form just to track some metrics for this event and to help improve future events. And second, we have an audience Q&A form. So if you have any questions at all, please feel free to submit them there. Our team in the back will be going through the questions during the event, and we'll have some of those questions answered at the end. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to our student moderator for the evening, Jonathan Min.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending tonight's session of the Berkeley Forum, a panel discussing the nuances of immigration policy within the United States, specifically the impact of H-1B visa. The format of this event will be as follows. I will introduce each of our speakers, after which they'll make brief speeches. Then we will move on to the moderated Q&A portion of this event. Finally, we will allocate time for audience questions, which will be done through a Google form sheet that will be linked in the chat. If you have any questions for the speakers throughout the event, feel free to fill out the form. To start off, I'm excited to introduce our first speaker for tonight, Sinduja Rangarajan. Sinduja Rangarajan is a senior data journalist at Mother Jones Magazine. Using data analysis and investigative reporting skills, she reported on the crackdown of the H-1B visas under the Trump administration. Her investigation found that the administration was wrongfully denying visas to qualified people and then quietly reversing their decisions when they were challenged in court. She previously worked at Reveal, at the Center for Investigative Reporting, where her series on the lack of diversity in Silicon Valley led to many tech giants publicly releasing their data.
Hi, everyone. I'm very excited for this opportunity. Thank you, Berkeley Forum, for organizing this and inviting me. Since I'm one of the first speakers for the night, even though there are lots of people with tons of experience here on the panel, I'll probably lay the context for H-1B, but at any point of time, Alan, Ron, if you feel like there's something that I've said that could be better explained, feel free to explain that when you're giving the introduction. So H-1B visas are temporary work permits that are given to, at least on paper and according to the intention of Congress, it was created so that they could bring in high-skilled workers into the United States. And it's supposed to be temporary. It's usually given for a period of 3 years. And then, you can extend it up to 6 years. And then in the meanwhile, people have always used it as a way to apply for a green card in those 6 years and then get a green card, move towards permanent residency, and then use permanent residency as a pathway to citizenship. I'm an immigrant from India, and a lot of Indians use the H-1B visas. In fact, 75% of all H-1B visas are given to Indians. So they use that as a way to immigrate into the United States. I am not on an H-1B visa, but my husband is. And it's one of those things that, doesn't get reported about as much as other parts of immigration. And actually, even till this administration came on board, it was never under the radar by media to the extent that it is today. And what essentially happened is that there were lots of things that were brewing under the behind the scenes in the background. But I think that this administration sort of just took an axe to that visa, and therefore, started denying people visas, and therefore, a lot of reporting has happened because of that. I want to, sort of lay the context based on my, own personal experiences. I live in the Bay Area. My husband works in tech, and also based on my reporting, lay some things that I've noticed. One of the things that I've noticed about the H-1B visa is, there's a wide variety of people using it. It's often like seen as, a tech visa, but that's not true. A lot of pharmacists use it, universities use it, and doctors use it. And the other thing I want to talk about is there's a difference in, there's a range of skills that the visa currently accommodates. So, you do have people who come in for IT jobs in IT companies, and you have all the controversies around, people coming on those visas being paid poorly, as compared to Americans, taking jobs away from Americans. So there is that. There's an IT contract portion of it, but there are also people who sort of come on this visa legitimately for very, very high skilled jobs. As an example, just something, very anecdotal is, me and my husband, we have 3 master's degrees. So there's multiple realities that are part of this H-1B visa. And essentially what I started noticing was in 2016 and 2017, obviously the visa program needs a lot of reform, because the way it is right now, there's just a huge backlog for Indians, who have H-1B visas, unable to sort of move to permanent residency, unable to obtain permanent residencies or green cards, and then use that as a way to obtain citizenship. The backlog for Indian, H-1B visa holders is very, very, very high. And some estimates say it's 50 years, some estimates say 150 years. Some people say, like I've heard that in my circles and background, that it may be faster to have a kid in the US and have them turn 21 or 18 and then apply for a green card than actually be on H-1B and then get a green card. So there are many realities, so obviously there's the system needs to be reformed for lots of reasons, and I'm sure the panelists will elaborate. But one thing that happened in this administration that I noticed was, Stephen Miller and Trump and the administration in general sort of started characterizing this visa as, it only brings in poorly educated guest workers. I quote Stephen Miller in one of my stories, and he said in a podcast in 2016, I think on the Breitbart podcast, he says, the reality is we're talking about less skilled foreign guest workers that are less educated than Americans, who are paid less than Americans, who know less about the computing industry and about the technology industry than Americans. And this administration basically just introduced a series of memos very quickly overnight and started denying people at very high rates. And then my investigation focuses, and then, people started suing the administration. This is the highest that, an administration has been sued for H-1B visas. So I tracked that. I called every attorney in the, in the country who had filed these visas to know what was going on behind the scenes, and noticed that, in almost 40% of the cases, USCIS would just reverse their decision the moment, the lawsuit, the moment people sued. So they would just settle the lawsuit and reverse the decision, which means that those people should not have been denied at all in the first place. The same kind of trend started happening with the appeals board. So USCIS, the agency that is supposed to process H-1B visas, agrees or approves or denies H-1B visas, has like an appeals board. And even there, you could see that normally those appeals don't get reversed, but under this administration, the agency's own appeals board was denying H-1B visas. And so I think that there was a way in which that this administration cracked down on H-1B visas that we've not seen. And just to finish off my presentation, I just want to add that a lot of the memos that they passed should have gone through the rulemaking process, which they didn't, which it didn't, and a lot of judges sort of asked them, the courts ruled that those memos were unlawful, and eventually most of those memos are invalidated right now, but still, it's been a very stressful period for H-1Bs because the rules haven't been consistent. And every day we hear, there's going to be some ban or the other on these visas.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Our second speaker for tonight is Alan Orr. Alan Orr is an immigration attorney from Washington, D.C., who was named the American Immigration Lawyers Association president-elect for the 2020-2021 term. Mr. Orr is the founder of Orr Immigration Law Firm, a minority-owned law firm based in Washington, D.C., focusing on U.S. corporate compliance as well as global corporate representation and assistance on immigration issues. He previously assisted in building one of the leading global immigration practices at a large global law firm, where he developed an international network of immigration practitioners, government officials, and business leaders.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much. So I'm going to be, because that was a pretty thorough presentation. So my organization is an organization of 16,000 lawyers, mostly in the United States, but we do have some foreign lawyers outside of the United States, some associates that sort of work with us to sort of talk about the H-1B program. And actually, as a young attorney, when I first graduated from law school, my first assignment was processing about 200 H-1Bs a year. And from that time in 1998 till today, you can see the decline in the number of applications that are sort of processed consistently, meaning the employer's reliance upon what they've done previously to get a new H-1B has changed. And I think the largest problem to understand the immigration dilemma and confusion is that immigration has not really been touched by Congress for over 2 decades. And so the problem is that we're dealing with numbers from a different time and probably a conversation about tech and technology from a different time, and some terminologies that probably haven't been caught up to date. So that's pretty much a synopsis, which causes a lot of problems with the backlog for some countries, and also the understanding of what the needs are for the labor market and what the intent of the H-1B visa sort of fits into. One of the things that I like to clarify is that a lot of individuals who use the H-1B visa are in fact educated in the United States. First on the F-1 student visa, and they sort of moved to the H-1B visa. So sort of saying that education isn't appropriate is somewhat problematic because it's U.S. education and they're educated here sometimes by also H-1B holders. In addition to that, my main practice right now of law is the compliance practice, in which I go and I work with the Department of Labor to ensure that Americans and or foreign nationals are paid the appropriate rate or the same rate in jobs. So that sort of conversation of saying that H-1Bs come in and they run down or they deprive Americans of the workforce or the labor isn't true. You will find out a lot of economists have published reports that basically say the more H-1Bs there are, the larger the increase in the wage. And you'll see that specifically throughout the 90s, that there's been about a 5% increase in tech jobs as far as the bottom wage over that time period. And I think right now, the most important thing to understand is what was highlighted last, is that the due process for H-1B processing isn't being carried out, which means arbitrarily this administration weekly has changed the rules to say now this means something different. And when things change that way, it's difficult for attorneys and for the individual employees to make decisions with regards to their lives and their workforce. And these aren't the type of decisions that are made weeks before. As you may know as a student, once you're hired sometimes during the summer, the job may not start to sometime later in the fall. So therefore, if the rules change or if the visa becomes unavailable, that causes problems for the production of the company. And I look forward to sort of addressing some of your questions and defining some of the terms that you might have questions about. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Our third speaker for tonight is Dr. Ron Hira. Dr. Ron Hira is an associate professor in the political science department at Howard University. Ron is also a research associate with the Economic Policy Institute. Hira has written widely on offshoring, high-skilled immigration, innovation, and the decline of the middle class. Hira is also co-author of Outsourcing America, which is a finalist for the Best Business Book in the PMA's Benjamin Franklin Awards. Additionally, Hira has testified numerous times before the US Congress about high-skilled immigration and offshoring.
Thank you, Jonathan, for that introduction, and thanks to Christy Malley for helping shepherd me through this process and inviting me to join the panel. So I'll make my remarks relatively brief. I want to hit just kind of a highlights of what the H-1B program is and some of the problems with it. So the H-1B program is a large and very important guest worker program. And there's about 600,000 or so H-1Bs here at any one time. We admit about 115 to 130,000 new H-1Bs each year. Like any guest worker program, the H-1B, you have to look at its design. It's very difficult to design guest worker programs. They can easily distort the labor market in significant ways. And so you need to put in really strong protections to ensure that the guest workers themselves are not being exploited, and also that you're not distorting and harming US workers who are competing with those guest workers. This is true whether you're talking about the United States or the United Arab Emirates, where they bring in a lot of guest workers. This is true whether you're talking about high-skilled, college-educated guest workers like H-1Bs, or agricultural workers who come typically on H-2As, or even summer work travel workers or optional practical training guest worker programs. So designing and getting the rules correct, are of paramount importance to ensure that you're not distorting both the labor market as well as the education market. The reality is the H-1B program fails on all of these levels. It severely distorts the labor market. It does not have adequate protections and safeguards in it. And instead, it's being used in a lot of ways for cheap indentured workers. And because of the nature of those rules, it not only harms the US workers, it also harms guest workers who are on the H-1B program. Now, there's the most egregious sort of examples of this is where US workers are asked before they get laid off to train their foreign H-1B replacement. So a company like Disney will hire a company like Cognizant, and major IT outsourcing company. Disney will transfer 200 of its positions from its IT shop to Cognizant, and in that transition will ask its Disney workers, as a condition of severance and unemployment insurance, to train their H-1B replacements. This is also true at the University of California, where you guys are. You should look this up. The University of California, San Francisco, actually forced 80 of its IT workers to train their replacements, their H-1B replacements. Clearly, it's not being used as intended to fill skills gaps when you've got US workers who already have the jobs and they're being directly displaced by H-1B workers. And this affects real people, people like Robert Harrison. So you should look up Robert Harrison in University of California. He was featured in 60 Minutes. Hank Wynn. You had the University of California Chancellor Janet Napolitano, who was asked, actually got letters from the congressional delegation from California to reverse her decision to force these workers out of their livelihoods, out of their employment, and force them to train their foreign H-1B replacements. Dianne Feinstein, Zoe Lofgren, a large number of congressional delegation wrote a letter to Janet Napolitano, who, by the way, used to be Secretary of Homeland Security and knows all about how the H-1B program is abused, and she refused. And the reason she said they had to go forward was the University of California could save money by outsourcing these jobs to H-1B workers. So they are paid less. That's the reason. The reforms that are needed are really around the rules and around protections. And these reforms, there's really bipartisan agreements on what needs to be done, including raising the wages, putting in some kind of labor market test, and putting in some enforcement. And this is not just conservatives, but you have progressives like Ro Khanna, Senator Dick Durbin. You've got Bernie Sanders, who have all talked about the need to reform the H-1B program by raising wages, by raising standards. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. And last but not least, our final speaker tonight is Andy Semotiuk. Andy Semotiuk is a US and Canadian immigration lawyer, a member of the New York and California bars in the United States, and he is also a member of the Ontario and BC bars in Canada. Mr. Semotiuk has been practicing law for over 40 years and has helped over 10,000 clients with various legal problems. Mr. Semotiuk practices with Pace Law Firm in Toronto, Canada, and writes a column on immigration for Forbes, where his articles have been read by 1 million readers.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank you for inviting me and for holding this webinar tonight. In terms of looking at the H-1B visa, I think I have a little bit of a unique sort of window to look at it through, and that's the fact that I practice not only in the United States, but also in Canada. And because of my writing for Forbes, I also often research other countries and their immigration programs. So I have a chance to kind of compare what's going on in the United States with other countries a little more closely than perhaps some of the others. I love the H-1B program. I wish it was better. I think it needs reform, but it is the workhorse for the United States. It is what the United States needs in order to become a real leader in terms of competing in the fist fight that's out there in the international community for high-skilled workers. This is not a place where you can relax and just have people apply to come to the United States. If you want the best, you've got to be out there aggressively campaigning for them, and you have to have a program that works. This program, normally, from my experience, what is going on here is applicants who want to come to the United States often start as F1 students, then move to the OPT for a year for optional practical training, then move to the H-1B program in the hopes of staying and working in the United States, and then hopefully move to a green card and ultimately to US citizenship. I think that's spectacular. It takes real effort to go through that process, and it takes years. A lot of people are stuck in that process for 10, 15, even longer years. And these people have the stamina to survive. The mere fact that they're surviving in applying in this way, I think needs to be looked at in terms of how this program is working. The program, I would say America is succeeding despite how this program is working, because of the people who are applying and who are giving their all to try and make it somehow through the immigration system. It's not true, in my experience, that people can come on this program and be paid low wages. You forget that you have to go through the Department of Labor and get approved there, and you have to prove that the offer of the job includes the prevailing wage or more. You have to go through Department of Homeland Security that reviews everything to make sure everything is kosher in terms of getting through. And then you have to go through the Department of the Secretary of State to get the visa. These people are vetted. These are people who are, for the most part, not, there are exceptions, but for the most part, these are pretty valuable people. And you have to consider an employer who's making an offer to a foreign worker. Consider the extra hardships that that person has to go through to bring that worker in. Like, why not hire a local worker? To get someone to work from overseas, in many cases, if not all of, or a lot of the cases, involves so much effort, so much extra cost and time, that it seems to me the people they're trying to recruit should be and likely are people who are better suited for the particular work that they're applying for, which is, after all, specialty work. So those are my preliminary comments, and I'd be very happy to talk more with everybody in terms of the questions and answers.
Thank you so much for all your presentations. We will now be moving into the moderated Q&A portion of this event. Just a quick reminder, there is a Google form sheet if you guys have any questions for the speakers, so feel free to fill that out with your name and the question that you have. At the end of the presentation, we will be going through these questions and asking the speakers those questions. So to begin, The headlines have recently been filled with talk about H-1B visas, mainly because of President Trump's action of signing an executive order to temporarily halt the H-1B visa program, citing rising unemployment due to COVID-19 and a need to protect American workers. How do you view the president's executive order and its impact?
Was that directed towards anyone, or just, I mean, I think the impact is a little bit, is scare tactics, and I think it's sending a message to a political base. At the end, it was sued. Many of these things have been sued, and it led to amendments that now give a harder time for an attorney to potentially get these individuals in, but there's still possible ways of doing such. So I think it was a little bit more political than actually a resolve, and most people in this arena were excluded from the actual proclamation with regards to H-1B visas overall. So the impact was small, but for actual numbers on employers, besides the hassle and financial cost of having to do extra work, but the political impact was very strong.
If I can add, I agree with Alan. I think generally this was made with a political stance. I feel like a lot of the executive orders and memos have been written that way, even if the program needs reform. I mean, the way this administration's been going about it has been really scary for someone like me. In terms of the impact, the first thing I realized is if I don't know everything about the executive order, but as it pertains to like people like me, who have a visa, you can get the visa approved while you're in the United States. But if you leave the country, you need the embassies to be open. You need the visa to actually be stamped. And I think that's where the actual difference will be if they, if they've done a ban, not just on new visas, but on existing visa holders when they leave the US, will they be allowed to come back? So there's a lot of uncertainty around that. And this is exactly the kind of stuff, that's like slow poison in a way, in the sense that something's still working, but it's like not clear. And you just see that there's obviously an attack on the visa.
So I think what's important in the executive order is what might come. And so in the executive orders, there were actually just two recent ones, one around the Tennessee Valley Authority, and then one a little bit of time ago back in June, and then there was actually one back in 2017 called the Buy American, Hire American. The real question is whether the Department of Labor is going to raise the standards. Are they going to raise wages? Are they going to start to enforce the actual wage provisions, some of the other kinds of protections that are supposed to be in the program? And if the Trump administration, meaning the agencies, the Secretary of Labor, Scalia, who wrote actually an op-ed about what he wanted to do, if they don't follow through with doing those kinds of actions of raising the prevailing wage so that it's really a market wage and not way below the market wage, then the executive order will have done no good for anybody, no good certainly for American workers. You really need that long-term regulatory fix there so that the protections actually protect.
The only thing I would add is H-1B is just one thing in a plethora of immigration reforms that are needed. But what has happened with H-1B so far, in my view, is not the best in terms of what could be done. Even on a reform level, I'm not sure going in the direction that that particular proclamation went is the right way to go.
So you all mentioned the idea of uncertainty in general, with lawyers, immigrants, and people in general just not knowing how to handle this H-1B visa process. So what, if any, are the implications of this uncertainty on the immigration process? Alan, you could start.
Yeah, sure. I actually did a tweet about this today. I think the actual focus of this administration is to break UCIS so that processing times don't work appropriately. It's not appropriately funded. There's some visa right now based on visa processing and COVID infected sort of delays in processing that have gone to a processing time of 2 years, which doesn't happen in other countries, right? Sort of processing delays for a very simple application doesn't take up to 2 years. And the same thing for the long-term H-1B and renewals and sort of the process. So I think the main message has been to say, you know, it's supposed to have been about people who are undocumented, but it's become more about people who are documented, and it's about immigration in general to say immigration is bad. And I understand the doctor's sort of comments with regards to the labor, but 95% of my practice is about labor enforcement on companies that have not paid the prevailing wage to companies, to either the American worker or the foreign worker. And so therefore, there is already legal provisions in there. And the concept of throwing additional fees at company really doesn't solve crime. I mean, that's a bad concept in any arena. If it costs more, doesn't mean necessarily that people aren't going to do it if there's really a need for it. So companies already pay substantial money into the market. So the concept has been that it sort of siphons off people from thinking America is the place to be. And when you're looking at sort of a particular labor force, they're going to start looking at other countries that are easier to go to, such as Canada, which has had a large impact from some people from Washington State and California, sort of moving their enterprises there so they can get the foreign labor in, or it might go to other companies such as Germany.
Let me just jump in there, just as a point that Alan has just raised. It may be interesting for you to look at the statistics in terms of where is all this technology going? And the answer is it's going out of Silicon Valley and up to Toronto. Toronto is the magnet for the new magnet in terms of technology workers. And you can just read a few articles, you'll see that. The reason, partial reason for that is because of the H-1B visa, the way it's not working essentially, and the need for a bit of reform. One of Canada's programs that's attractive is a startup program where someone with an idea can come to Canada and get backing in order to start up a company and start a new Google or whatever. That's something the US needs to look at too. But the H-1B program is one of the reasons why this Canadian, and it's not just Canada, there are other countries that are also stealing workers away from the United States.
So, the H-1B program is way oversubscribed. And instead of selecting people based on their highest skills or the highest wages, we instead run a lottery system. So you have 250,000 applicants for 85,000 slots. That doesn't make much sense. And so if you really wanted to pick sort of the highest skilled folks, one way to do that would be highest wages, either through wage levels or the total wages. But I don't think we should have uncertainty. I mean, I think you should have a clear process. And as Sinduja said earlier, these are guest worker programs, and having people in limbo, if you're from India and you're thinking about coming to the US, even if you're going to get an H-1B, it's very unlikely you're going to get a green card unless you can get an EB-1, a very high level unusual green card employment base. So we're not going to attract the best and brightest with a system like that where the H-1B program is flooded with cheaper workers. We should have a much better selection process. We can raise the standards significantly and still bring in a higher skill level of 85,000 workers. And then, of course, we need to do something on the green card side of things. So the process is really kind of very broken in lots of ways, and not to the advantage necessarily of the U.S.
The only thing I want to add to this, in my investigation as well, I noticed that there's a significant uptick of, people moving to Canada. There's obviously a little bit of privilege at play. These are people who are coming in with skills, degrees. They don't have to put up with, bad policies, et cetera, and so they have options. A lot of immigrants don't have options. So at least this group probably has options to move to other places. In my case, personally, I think the program, because of how long it has been and how broken it has been really exhausting. And the uncertainty adds to the exhaustion. Am I going to get through one more year? What policy is this government going to change? Because when I came into the US in 2012, there was nothing that allowed H-1B, spouses of H-1B to work. But by the time I got my journalism degree, there was a program for that. And then, so I got that visa, and then immediately Trump came into power and he said, okay, let's, axe that program. It's called H-4EAD. So it's been so uncertain that it's been really hard to plan for stability. And, obviously the group of immigrants from India, they want to move from a country that's developing into a country that's developed, where their skills can be utilized, where they have a better quality of life. You know, the quality of life argument comes up all the time, but it's not worth the struggle that the United States is putting us through. And so, you know, Canada is a better option. There are some, you know, European countries that are better options. Singapore is an option. But ultimately, I want to say that even India is an option because, you know, it's a stable country. It's got a democracy. It's not doing so badly as, you know, as some of the other countries which are, you know, which are torn apart by civil wars or things like that. So this is a different group of immigrants who have a bunch of options to go back, including India, because the struggle in the United States is not worth it, and it's exhausting and uncertain and stress-inducing.
Thank you. Pressing on with this conversation about the international implications of immigration policy and demand for workers in these countries, how does the H-1B visa program policy-wise compare to the high-skilled immigration programs of other nations? Andy, could you start us off on that?
Yes, I've already mentioned for example, the startup visa in Canada. And look, I think what we need, if we're going to reform, and we can only reform the H-1B program, let's reform the H-1B program and make it a good one. And I think to do that, what we have to do is eliminate some of the tedium involved in applying, maybe reduce the numbers along the line of what Ron has mentioned by raising some standards and so on. But let's make an honest program out of it so people can see if they go down that program, there's an end, a desirable end along the lines of a green card, as it is in a place like Canada. If you come to Canada as a tech worker and you come in on one of the global entry program or whatever, they're matched up for the most part with some possible landing in Canada. It's not going to take 20 years. It takes maybe 2 years or 3 years. Now, there are other programs. Sinduja has mentioned a few of them, but it's beyond our time to be able to go into much detail on them. But I think the key here, I mean, if I were to take something out of this webinar, if we're going to focus on H-1B, let's reduce the tedium of it. Let's make it easier for employers to go after these high-skilled workers. Let's get the high-skilled workers and the sort of lower levels out. Let's clean it up and make it easier to work with. And then let's go aggressively into the marketplace internationally and compete.
I worked at an international law firm, so a little bit of the Canadian is different because the provinces can do different levels of sponsorship based on their needs. So sort of saying what the United States needs as one nation is a little bit difficult and problematic. And decreasing the numbers doesn't agree with my free market analogy, because I don't think that the government, as a former Republican, is the best position to decide for a company what their need is for an employee. Nor are they better suited to say one American is more qualified than another American for that position for that company. So therefore, we sort of think about these free market decisions that are made, just don't eliminate that people can go to places to get the exact person that they want. And it's not a sum-zero game. As you increase, like in many popular cities, when you increase the workforce overall, labor raises together. So there are more jobs that are created across the board. And this competition assumes that these people are equally educated for the same position, which is not necessarily true about the level of degrees in these STEM academies when you specifically talk about that many of these teachers at these universities themselves are on H-1B visas. In addition to understanding this, if the government found this so problematic, they wouldn't sponsor or have around the 3,000 H-1B workers that literally work for the government and across the United States in these different arenas. So there's a fallacy of having this conversation about H-1B workers getting low wages. Dismiss that. It's regulatory, it is not allowed. There may be issues where it does happen, just like crime, and it should be enforced and turned over to the government. But as a wide scheme, that is not the case. Sort of saying to decrease the numbers in any case about immigration really isn't a solution to anything. That isolation is sort of, I'm afraid, therefore no more numbers. No, it should be about the market and the understanding of how these businesses develop. And in many of Andy's articles that you will read, you will find that many of these companies that today employ tens of thousands of Americans were started by one foreign national. So if that one foreign national gets in any arena, be it the EB-5, the H-1B, or any of the other sectors, we should be open to that, because we're about making America great. If making America great means excluding other people, then that's really not making America great.
So I'll just make just a couple comments based on, things that Alan just said. First off, it isn't a free market, right? The government is deciding to intervene into the market to introduce guest workers, right? The whole concept of bringing in a guest worker is that the labor market, as it is, the domestic labor market, isn't adequate. So we hear about this in the H-2A program in the agriculture farm workers. Look, people just don't want to pick the crops. It's too hard to work, et cetera, et cetera. So the government needs to intervene into the market and really distort the market, right? Because the claim is that there's a market failure. So if you're going to do that with a guest worker program, whether it's in the US with agriculture workers, or if in the United Arab Emirates, where they have a lot of guest workers come in from different countries, you got to do it the right way so that you don't actually make things worse than they actually are. So this is not one American versus another American. When someone is on an H-1B, they're not an American. They're a guest worker. They don't have the same rights. You've got to create a whole new labor market regime around that, and that's difficult. And if you want to do that, then you've got to create the right safeguards. The protections and safeguards are not adequate in the H-1B program. It is extensively used for cheap labor. And, Southern California Edison is a perfect example where 400 of their workers were laid off or had to train replacements or were displaced by workers from HCL and Cognizant. And in fact, they complained to the Labor Department, and the Labor Department investigated and said, yep, everything is fine. There's not a problem here. You can be replaced by H-1B workers. Again, not Americans, by guest workers. And remember, the employers are driven by profit. Employers don't have the national interest in their purview. What they're interested in doing is maximizing profit. And if I was running a business and I could get cheaper guest workers, that not only can I pay them less, but I can control them in significant ways, I'm going to make a lot of profit doing that. I can rationalize it in many different ways. The job of politicians and policymakers is to ensure that there is a fair level playing field for not just the guest workers, but also for U.S. workers.
A couple of things that I wanted to add to this is that's where, when I first spoke in my presentation, there's a dichotomy there's a range of skills and there's a dichotomy of workers, because, you can always find examples of Disney, a Southern California Edison, but then you also have like companies paying extra money to bring in these laborers or these workers in a place like, in a place like Facebook or Netflix, and, where the average engineer salaries are way beyond six figures. But so there are both those things that are happening. The big thing that's happening, particularly with the H-1B, which is causing the program to be inefficient, is happening for folks who are coming from India and China, and mostly Indians because of the backlog, the green card backlog, which is why, despite my husband being in the US for, I want to say, he's had an H-1B since 2009, 11 years. We're nowhere close to getting a green card. So we just keep, relying on these temporary extensions. And in the middle, the government can change, can put up new rules. And, we've been here for a long time, a decade or so. So that's the big pain point, the backlog, the green card backlog. And I feel like that's driven by the fact that, every year, 7% of any country, 7% of the green cards go to one particular country, and 7% of green cards for Indians is not enough because it's a country of 1 billion people. It has the youngest, it's one of the younger countries. So there's a lot of talent and skills coming from that one country. And it's similar for China. So clubbing India and China along with, other countries, perhaps let's say Germany or Italy or Canada, isn't a fair numbers game, and saying all of them sort of deserve 7%. And I think that's, again, a part of the reason why H-1Bs are so problematic, because the pain caused by the backlog set by the 7% cap on the countries as a policy decision. And so there's obviously that at play.
You all touched on the idea that the immigration process is highly laborious and quite burdensome, resulting in immigrants waiting years, even decades to earn visas and eventually citizenship. What reforms, if any, would alleviate the backlogging of immigrants? Sinduja, you could start.
I think there's one bill that's already being pushed for, and definitely, you know, Indians very much want that bill, which eliminates country caps. But again, it has its own problems because even if Indians, it'll clear the backlog for Indians, it sort of, you know, will create problems and backlogs for people from other countries. So basically, process green cards as they come, not by a country cap or a country quota. Remove the quota is what the one bill addresses. I think it passed through the House, but was blocked in the Senate by Senator Dick Durbin. So that there's that. The other solution for one part of H-1Bs is H-1Bs for doctors, especially given, you know, COVID-19 and the amount of need for doctors. Again, you know, sort of remove, give like green cards that are left over every year and distributed to doctors for an H-1B. So there's that as a solution, which again, I don't know if it's passed or not passed. And then there's the general thinking that, you know, for the people, reform the H-1B program, you know, bring in the highest paid, highest skilled, whatever, clear up or reform the criteria for who should get in and who shouldn't. But for the people who've been slogging here for like many, many years and decades, please give them the green cards. Just give them. I mean, who's creating these, you know, oh, we only have like 5,000 green cards to give out every year. Like, you can increase the number of green cards you give, end the misery for the people who've already been here for decades, and, you know, create a new program going on. So there's like that line of thinking that's not related to any bill, but that's the hardest to pass, given, you know, how a lot of Republicans don't want to increase like the number of green cards. Like, that's not, that would be like, they're generally not for that option, but that to me feels like the most ideal and fair option. And then there are these two bills that I'm aware of, but I'd love to hear from the other speakers.
So for me, once again, it's just increasing the numbers to a modern time. You can't sort of work with the same numbers that you worked with in the 80s and sort of reforming the system overall. So the concept of keeping the numbers consistent is sort of an anti-growth analysis to me, a company that grows and does more employees. One of the other ways to sort of address the problem is to remove counting dependents in the number. It should be only the primary worker, and therefore the wife and the kids shouldn't count in the work category, which will increase a greater number, which is a very small change and tweak that has sort of been talked about with those increased conversations, because we're talking about so many workers. And if you count the kids and all of the dependents, then many are going to dependents that should be going to workers. And that's a simple way to sort of have a conversation and have the numbers remain sort of the same as you're talking about the initial workforce, because we don't sort of have a limitation on birth. And I think the other concept, when you start talking about, you know, these wages and increasing fees, once again, most of the people who do H-1B visas hire an employment attorney like me, and I am not cheap. So therefore, you're not going to get a cheap lawyer to then do a visa for someone that you're going to pay them less wages for. So that doesn't really sound appropriate. And these sort of engagements that last for decades, which I also don't believe is fair, which started in 1965 with the 7-year quota, which there is equity, but across the board at that time when they sort of did that, but it does sort of have a discriminatory impact right now. So it's solving a problem that's existed for a long time. And the real issue is to sort of address immigration as a comprehensive sort of way of moving forward. And, you know, before, when I sort of talked about with Ron Soaring at the free market, I was saying what it should be, not necessarily what it is. But in that way, there are many ways in which an employer could then just discriminate against an African American or some other person for getting the job. So if the real concern is about American individuals getting jobs, then the government should be concerned at every level, and not just about whether it's a foreign national or not. It should be about total equity, if that's the really bottom line concern. And at this very minimal issue when we're talking about this is the minimum wage has not been increased for decades either. So if we were really talking about people making a living wage, that would be at the forefront of all of these conversations, not this immigrant conversation, because that raises all the boats of all American workers.
Just to toss in some controversy so that we're not all agreeing on everything. There are reservations. I have some reservations about eliminating the 7% per country rule in terms of how it may be eliminated, because it, in the case of Canadians, could put some of the Canadians who are applying for these same visas back like 20 years in a waiting line. So there's some issue in that regard. So what we need is more green cards, not necessarily the 7% thing, but we could use more green cards for all the countries. There's a debate that we need to have on that subject. I think one of the critical issues here is people don't understand the H-1B visa process. They keep seeing these lower wages. You have to go through the Department of Labor and persuade them that you're going to be offering the prevailing wage or the actual wage, whichever one is higher. It's the government who's determining what is the prevailing wage, and the employer has to meet that prevailing wage or higher. So how do you drive down wages when you have to meet the prevailing wage? And an added element here is Ron keeps referring to these workers as guest workers, and that they are sort of an impairment of the free market. I think the free market is driving this. The companies need these workers. They want foreign workers, but they can't get them because of the program or the government's programming in terms of getting these workers. It's not that we're bending all the rules so we can invite all these foreign guests to come to our country. It's the opposite. We need these guests, our aging population, and the fact that these leaders can bring in more jobs than we give them is why we want them in the country. So those are my comments.
So I'll just make a couple quick comments. One is, I think the issue that Sinduja raises around these long backlogs puts in very stark relief the difference between a guest worker and somebody who has a green card, somebody who has employment and labor rights. They'd much rather have a green card than be a guest worker. Why is that? Because they have stability, they have rights, they can switch jobs much more easily, and so on and so forth. So if we really need people to fill the labor market, we should be looking to do it with green card holders, with actual immigrants, as opposed to people that are in sort of a permanent guest worker status. I mean, that's just not good for those workers. It's also not good for the labor market. It's not good for U.S. workers either, to be competing against people that are in this indentured, precarious kind of position. And so it does damage all the way through in terms of the labor market. In terms of prevailing wage, it's a pretty straightforward response. Prevailing wage sounds like market wage, but it's set by the Department of Labor at the 17th percentile for level 1 wage. I'm happy to send you my papers, Andy, on this. It's pretty straightforward. The Labor Department has basically mispriced the prevailing wage. It's set it so low that it's 40% below the median wage. So the 17th percentile is the minimum wage for a level 1 wage worker. 17th percentile, the average wage would be the median, right? 50th percentile. So your wages are way, way below what the median wage is. Now we can talk about where we should set that prevailing wage. I think it should be at least the median, probably the 65th or 75th percentile for the particular occupation. And not to get too much into the weeds, but it's really important because you're using these terms. You're a lawyer, you know about these terms, and it's really important to dig down into where we're setting that prevailing wage. And the Labor Department should just raise that very significantly. And in terms of you're getting into this whole issue of whether there's really skill shortages or not, there really is no evidence that there's a skill shortage. There are very talented folks who come in on H-1Bs, who come in on L-1s, who come in on O-1s. We want them. We want to get them to a green card as fast as possible if they're interested in a green card process. But you've got to have a vetting process. You've got to have some kind of front end that says these people are really bringing in genuine skills. Just having the employer say, we really want this worker, you don't know if they really want the worker because they're bringing in some specialized skills, or if they want them because they know they're going to be tethered to the company, they know they're going to be cheaper, and they're getting some other benefits out of living in the country, and so they'll take a lower wage. So you have to have a referee, and that's the role the government has not played. And the Labor Department has not played that role in any serious way. In fact, its own Office of Inspector General has called that process, the labor condition application, really just a rubber stamp. So it's a toothless oversight. And that's really where we need to have some protections. In terms of the skills shortage, I'm happy to talk about that, but you can look at it in terms of wages, employer behavior, the discrimination that goes on in the tech industry against women as well as underrepresented minorities is pretty widespread. The age discrimination, I mean, any employer behavior that you look at, you can say there really is no evidence that there's any kind of systemic widespread skill shortage that H-1B workers are filling. There are certainly always gaps in there where there's really talented folks. And the solution is to maximize that and to sort of minimize the distorted parts of the supply that are coming in on H-1Bs.
For the sake of time, this will be my final question. So you all mentioned this intimate relationship between the government, employers, and H-1B employees. Specifically for an H-1B visa's linked to a specific employer, some have argued that there's a lack of mobility for visa holders, giving companies too much leverage over H-1B holders. What, if any, reform should be implemented to lessen the tie between employers and their employees' immigration status? Andy, could you start?
Well, I think at the moment there's this portability that's available to H-1B workers who want to move from one employer to another, and it's reasonable in terms of how that's done. They just simply have to have the new employer file an application, and then with the receipt, you can, assuming that it's a bona fide application, you can move over to the new employer and wait for the ultimate resolution of the processing. Perhaps that's not enough. Maybe more mobility is required. If it is, I'd like to think of it in terms of attaching whatever rights there are to the employee versus attaching them to the employer. If they're, we have to think this out, but I assume if these employees are being chosen through a government program, then it's being determined that they are valuable to the economy. And if they are valuable to the economy, then perhaps we could sort of assign them the visa right, which would mean mobility as part of the visa right versus just approving the employer and having them sort of manipulate how people are going to be working in the United States. That's the best I can give you in like 3 minutes.
So I just say that this aspect of control and bargaining power over a worker is very important for employers, right? I mean, they take advantage of this in a big way. And we see this even at the big tech companies, right? So there's a famous wage theft case that your audience should really look up that included the very top levels of Apple and Google, and I think even Intel, conspiring basically not to poach each other's engineers. So you had the emails that came out in this court case where Steve Jobs and Eric Schmidt, CEOs of Apple and Google, were conspiring to say, hey, we're not going to hire your engineers because we don't want to raise wages and we want to keep them in their places. And that's really has important ramifications in multiple ways, including stifling innovation. One of the reasons Route 128 in Boston did not develop even though it had its major computer industry, didn't develop the same way that Silicon Valley did, is in part because it's very hard in California to enforce non-compete agreements. And so the old saying is technology transfer is a body contact sport. So as engineers went from Sun Microsystems to other companies, they actually transferred knowledge and capability. So we should be encouraging sort of that transfer. Now, the way that you do that with guest workers is you'd rather have them have green cards so that they have rights and they can move and they can start companies, because they can't start companies as H-1B workers, right? They're not allowed to. They have to be employed. So we should be looking at immigration solutions as opposed to guest worker programs. And I like the idea that Andy was talking about, which is moving more towards a merit point system where somebody comes in based on their own merits, as opposed to an employer who has an inherent conflict of interest in terms of bargaining in selecting people and then being able to control them.
I like the idea of green cards. I don't know if it's actually going to happen. That seems like so much work in terms of how it's going to happen. I think, even moving from one employer to another employer, a couple of things that happen is, there is a portability of visa or whatever. I'm on an O1. You have to file a new visa every time you change your employer. But depending on your case, I don't want to get into the specifics. But so H-1B is a little portable, but the green card process, you have to restart the green card process, which is a burdensome, lengthy, expensive, paperwork involving process. So if there's a way for green card holders whose, green cards have been approved, but they still are waiting in the queue for their next level of processing or whatever, and that queue can be decades long, can they just move jobs without having to deal with the green card, where the green card I feel like that's something that can be implemented, but again, you have to restart the green card process as the way it is. And I've noticed a lot of people don't want to change jobs because they're waiting. They're like, I know someone who's been waiting for their green card for 10 years. They have, their date is for 2010 and it's 2020 right now, but the USCIS has been processing 2008 and 2009 for a long time, so those who applied for their green cards in 2008 and 2009. So this person's like, let me just wait for a little bit time. And then that little bit time turned out to be 10 years and they've still not processed their green card yet. So that's one big reason why people don't switch jobs and put up with abuse, exploitation. And some of it is very subtle. Some of it is very, unbearable. In those cases, people have to change jobs, but a lot of it is just very subtle, subtle discrimination, subtle sort of stuff that's happening, exploitation in the workplace. So I think that's another big thing, and stability of the visa process. You can be a temporary worker for a long time if the process is stable, but 10 years down the line, you've been waiting in this, you've been thinking of getting a green card, that's the path you followed for your life. And then if things change with every administration, I think that's, again, and the administration introduces uncertainty and forces you to self-deport or whatever, then that's another thing that's not super helpful. In my case, for example, Canada has this great merit-based point immigration system or whatever, but they also have age. The younger you are and the more qualified you are, the better points you get. But if you're over 30, the points start reducing. So, we spent the youth of our lives giving, in the United States, betting on this country, but this country sort of betrayed us and let us down. So if in the 20s we realized that this is what is going to happen to us, then we would have gone to Canada and we would have been able to crack through their, merit-based point system or whatever. So I feel like those are all the factors to sort of consider when we think about job portability.
So first, the United States does have a merit-based system. It's just the merit is employment and family. So using fancy terms like merit, I think it sort of changes the conversation to something that's bright and shiny. Maybe revamping the system is something. One of the easiest ways to sort of help employees at this time is just allow individuals to file early adjustments. and maybe not let them sort of hold in to get it to the green card to when it is, but let them apply the adjustment. So therefore they're sort of stabilizing their position and they can take full advantage of portability. And that doesn't sort of have these long delays in the processing for the family and be able to get work authorizations and have a true number of who's here. So that's a very simple solution that could happen and has happened a number of times based on the visa bulletin. I think that, you know, there is somewhat of a concern that happens in that case, just like anyone who gets a scholarship that goes to a school. You know, you're expected to perform well for that university while you're there because they're paying for you to be there. So there's a little bit of a concept that weighs on both sides where you sort of say this indentured servitude. I do see it, I understand that, but I do also understand that employers are somewhat putting themselves on the line and investing in individuals. If they just become a pipeline where you just sort of say, okay, you got the visa, now they go to another company and they go to another company. So then you say, well, maybe their wages aren't appropriate, and that sort of increases the wages. And I think that that's one of the issues that has sort of happened in the past. And I think there are many companies that make agreements that they're not going to take other people's employees for a long time. Law firms do it in a lot of senses in major areas where they're not going to accept a lawyer. So I don't think that's something that's exceptionally hard and difficult to understand in a certain arena where people are doing developmental work. So I don't think that that's the exception. So I just sort of feel like the other thing that I want to say is that many of these people, to get to the green card, they have to do a labor market test through the Department of Labor against American workers. And those cases are approved. So therefore, there is an example to show there's a labor shortage, because those cases would not be approved if there were Americans that were qualified for those jobs. So that's a little bit of a false kind of statement to say, oh, it doesn't show there's a shortage, but we know a number of these people move through the labor process where they show there is in fact a shortage. So that's just, you know, the walkaway comments with regards to that.
If I could just quickly respond, there is no labor market test for the H-1B program.
Yeah, so just to clarify, because I think it's important for students to know, the concept isn't, the concept was that there's no labor market shortage. And I just sort of thought, well, let's sort of think about the full process, because he said most of them go through the green card process. And for the green card process, there is a labor market shortage. And since most of them move through the green card process, and they therefore do test the labor market at that point, then therefore there must be a labor market shortage because those labor certs are approved.
Well, thank you guys all so much for answering all of my questions. We will now be moving into the audience Q&A section. The link will be resent in the chat, so if you have a question, please fill out the form. So to start off, we have a question from Rachit. Do you see any potential for significant changes in policies affecting dependence on H-1B workers in the coming years? Sinduja, could you please start us off?
You know, I'm a downer on this. I think others should talk about this. I just feel like personally, if I get my hopes high up, I'm gonna be here for more disappointment. So I don't see things moving or changing differently, especially under this administration. So it really depends on the elections in November. I cannot imagine that the president or his allies would change their stance or would reform the H-1B program significantly. They have been talking about the wage setting and things like that, but I don't know if they've done anything. But I want to hear from Ron, who I think has testified, and I want to hear from the others if they feel more optimistic.
So I'll go, and then I think it depends, like was stated on the administration. I'm glad you're on the panel because you add the human side of the story that sort of shows that even a professional like yourself, and such a high profile that creates articles and writes about the situation, the uncertainty that sort of exists, and why voting appropriately or voting in the interest of how we want America to be seen is appropriate. So I just sort of feel like it really depends on the administration. We know that if the current administration continues through exactly what Ron said, through some of these amendments or regulations with regard to H-1Bs, they've sort of shown they're going to change the wage level. They're going to decrease the numbers. They're going to move in a different direction. And I think the Biden and Harris administration, which is published on their website, is moving in a different direction. So I just sort of feel like it depends on where that goes. So for me, being an immigration attorney and seeing the downsides in business pursuant to COVID, as well as that, I think remain hopeful. Don't give up on the dream. I mean, that's part of what the American spirit is.
I'll just touch on two things. One is we have a pandemic and the economy is not doing very well right now. So there's a lot of pressure on the government, and no matter who gets into power, if the economy is, still kind of in a logjam, maybe it won't be so easy to get things improved. once things recover, it might be a little better. I also think that in terms of government policy, well, there are two things. The international marketplace will come into play if the economy improves and the competition continues the way it is. That may be a factor that may induce the government, even Trump's government, to take a look at this program and try and do something with it. But if the election puts Biden into the presidency, maybe there'll be a change in another direction on the program.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. An anonymous person asks, outside of the economic impacts of H-1B visas, what further implications do H-1B visa holders have on the US? Ron, could you start us off?
Well, I think the framing of a lot of the discussion is around economics, right? So anytime you're talking about guest worker programs, you're really talking about the claim that there's an economic need. So on the lower skilled side, the agriculture or the H-2B workers, they're saying these are jobs that Americans don't want to do. And on the higher skill side, the claim is that these are jobs Americans can't do, which of course, as I've discussed, there's lots of cases where, in fact, Americans were doing those jobs. But these are human beings, right? And Sinduja is talking about this. This is the human element, both in terms of the H-1B workers, but also American workers who are out there, who are competing with them. And we should be thinking about them as immigrants rather than guest workers, right? When we start to use the frame of guest worker, which is the way the program is set up and the justification for the program, we think of them as economic agents. And that's why shifting towards immigration away from guest worker programs, I think makes much more sense, in terms of how you want at least U.S. policy to approach. These are human beings. Hopefully you want them to become citizens of the country as opposed to just purely economic cogs in a wheel. I hate to put it that way. That's not what they are. They're real people, right?
I'll just say that I have a stronger impression that these workers are indeed rare or specialized, and that's why they're needed in the United States. In fact, I've just drafted an article on Forbes on that, and I'm quoting a number of studies that have come to that conclusion. So I'm going to dispute a little bit with Ron on the issue of whether these workers are needed or not. But on the human side, this is the area of innovation, of exploration of new frontiers. It's an area where people are investing their lives to try and build America and make America better for everybody, for the immigrants coming in and for those who are here and who will benefit from employment. There's a study that goes along the lines that for every worker that comes in, there's five jobs that are created. It's in this area. So there's an economic impact to others from the fact that some workers are allowed to come in and work. We can quibble over, exactly what kind of worker, and we can refine that. But I think generally, an aging America who is less competitive today than it was, say, a decade or two before, in terms of it seems to be slowing down in competitiveness and more isolated worldwide. These are all factors that are playing in on this issue of H-1B workers.
And just to go full circle with that, it's also important to understand that it's a chilling effect on immigrants around the world to say, this is the place to be for immigrants, a safe place or an opportunity to come to for immigrants. So they're going to start looking for other opportunities, other places. But the real impact also comes to education, and which you've sort of seen that already happen when there were some changes or supposed changes to the F-1B rules with regards to in-person classes when we sort of froze that. So a lot of people come to United States schools and universities with the expectation that they might get to an H-1B. If that expectation is removed, then those schools will remove those individuals who are in that area. And some of those individuals in that area are greater skilled, right? Sure, everybody's a software engineer, but the skill set for an innovator may be different than the skill set for an everyday worker. And when you remove those innovators from the equation and you remove that student workforce, then just like with the US workforce, you're not hurting just today, you're building up a deficit, a tunnel of a backlog of innovators for years to come. So sort of making this sort of incentive of sort of saying, we're not interested in sort of doing something after graduation where these individuals generally pay full freight for school in the United States becomes extremely problematic. And in some cases where those individuals go on to become the professors or the Nobel Prize winners, which you see in many cases, is even more problematic.
So this will be the last question for tonight from the audience. So this is again an anonymous question. If we did end up picking who gets an H-1B visa depending on merit or wages, how would we combat having a potentially homogenous group of people who are getting the visas every year? Ron, could you start us off on this?
Yeah, so there's no perfect selection criteria, right? By definition, when you have criteria in there, there's going to be, cases where you're like, wow, we really should have had that person versus this person or whatever it might be. So the current system's clearly not working very well. It's way oversubscribed. You have 200, plus thousand for 85,000 slots. So 1 in 3 are going to win the lottery. And we choose it as a lottery. So that $60,000 worker who's working for an outsourcing company replacing a US worker has the same chance as somebody who's working at a small startup making 150,000. That doesn't make much sense, right? So the current system isn't a very good one. It's not selective. In fact, it favors the large outsourcing companies that can flood the application process, the petition process. And it actually it disfavors the small startup that has a very specific worker that they actually want to hire through the H-1B lottery process. So there's been some discussion about, and this is across the ideological spectrum. You've got people from Cato talking about this, Bill Kerr from the Harvard Business School talking about let's use a wage selection process where the highest wages are the folks who will get the 85,000 slots. So you take the 200,000, you rank order them by wages, the top wages will go there. Now, what does that do? If you did that, it certainly would skew towards the high wage occupations. It would skew towards high cost of living areas, California, the Bay Area, which is high cost of living, so wages tend to be higher there. Another way to do this would be by doing it with the wage level. So based on your occupation, and if you're paying way above what the median wage rate is for that occupation. So a journalist is paid a lot less than a software engineer on average. If that journalist is being paid a lot more than the median wage, then maybe they have preference over somebody who's being paid, a software engineer who's being paid less relative to the median wage, but more absolute to the journalist, if that makes sense. So you're looking at relative wages within an occupation and a geographic location. That would be an alternative way. But we know the current system really just favors many large firms that flood the market, flood the petitions and application process with really people that have very ordinary skills. 60% of the applications that were approved by the Labor Department last year were for wage levels 1 and 2, which are way below the median wage. So we know that those companies are going to be there. Should they have an equal or better chance than people who are paying wage level 4, the 67th or 75th percentile? I don't think so.
I mean, to add to that, I don't know if the question, I don't know what they mean by homogeneity. Certainly, Ron's answer of homogeneity, whether we look at, the kinds of industries that end up using H-1B workers, the wages could be one way of interpreting. If there's other, interpretations of homogeneity, for example, country, or I think currently, there is a lottery process which is flawed, but I don't think there's any, it's just sheer dumb luck. So more people from certain countries apply, and therefore by probability they get selected versus, I think the top 3 countries, correct me if I'm wrong, are India, China, and Mexico. I think the larger macro context to this is they're very big countries, big economies, young populations that are skilled. In the case of India, they know English, and mostly they're classified by the UN as developing countries, which means that they're looking for they're looking to move to more developed economies to use their skills and, have a quality of life. And especially in the case of Indians, if you see, obviously they're flooding the H-1B market, but there's also a backlog with the extraordinary ability visa. There's also a backlog with the EB-5 investor visa. So they're everywhere. It's a big country, and the population is 1 billion, and there's a macroeconomics perspective to it as to why they're why they're queuing up everywhere, as opposed to, let's say, Germany or Sweden or Canada or other countries. So I think that sort of can answer the homogeneity question. There are other visas. I mean, this is particularly focused, like Ron said, on skill and wage. There are visas, like, for example, there's a diversity visa or immigrant visa that, sort of gets people from all kinds of countries, so that the US can be more diverse, just allocated for that purpose and reason. So I think that for this particular visa, this is probably driving the homogeneity. If you're interpreting homogeneity as something that relates to national origin.
Well, that's all the time we have, unfortunately. Thank you again for answering our questions. I'd like now to invite our president, Cindy Tang, back up to the stage for some closing remarks.
Awesome. Thank you so much to Jonathan for moderating this event, and to all 4 of our panelists again for speaking tonight. So at all of our events, we have a communications team that designs a custom poster for all of our speakers, which we typically would deliver in person, but unfortunately we are unable to do that now. But as soon as we get back to school, we will be printing these posters out and mailing them to you all. But this is the poster for tonight's event. We'd also like to just once again thank everyone for coming, whether this is your first, second, or infinite number of events that you've attended. We'd like to ask that you please use the QR code or tiny URL to give us feedback so we can continue to improve our virtual events for this semester. And if you'd like to learn more or follow for future events, please like us on Facebook or visit our website. Our next event will be this coming Thursday with Ken Klippenstein. And if you're willing and able, please support us to help us keep all of our events free and open to the public. Any amount will go towards putting on our events, whether virtually or online. And we would just like to thank you once again for joining tonight's edition of the Berkeley Forum. And props again to our entire internal team for putting on this great event. And thank you again to our 4 panelists.